really irritates my paleoanthropological colleagues, that the major advance in human evolution in the past 3 or 4 decades has got nothing to do with fossils.
Hello, I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Bernard Wood, who is a University Professor of Human Origins at George Washington University. So welcome, Professor Wood. Could you please give a brief overview of your career and research?
Hi, it's very good to speak with you. I've spent all my career earning a living as a teacher and a researcher, and as an administrator. I've been head of department. I was head of department in the UK and the dean of the medical school at the University of Liverpool before I came to the States. And since I've been here, I've mercifully been released from most of the administration. I started out in life as a medical student and I qualified as a doctor, but I had an interest in anatomy. And that led me to do an additional degree, a Bachelor of Science. And the classes that I had included primatology with John Napier and human evolution with Michael Day. And as a result of that, Michael Day managed to get me the opportunity to go with Richard Leakey to northern Kenya in 1968. And so I gradually got more and more involved in human evolution and less involved in surgery. And so instead of being a surgeon, I was involved in teaching prospective surgeons anatomy or educating them in anatomy. So that's my career in a nutshell.
Thank you. And of all the fossil taxa and evolutionary questions you've explored, which do you consider your most significant contribution and why?
Well, I think it's for other people to consider what's significant. I can tell you what interested me, but I guess realistically, it's the monograph that I wrote in 1991, trying to make sense of the fossils that were recovered from East Rudolph, and latterly it was called Cubifora. That was a bit of a challenge because the fossils covered quite a time span, and they clearly didn't belong to a single species. And the question was, how many species did the collection sample, and what were the taxa? Were there any new taxa in the sample, or if there were existing taxa, which fossils belonged to the existing taxa? And most of the puzzle revolved around what's loosely called early Homo. And I'm still trying to sort that puzzle out many decades later.
Thank you. And is there a perspective you hold, whether about taxonomy, behavior, or methods, that differs from the prevailing view in paleoanthropology?
Yes, I think there is, because I tend to be a splitter in terms of taxonomy. It seems to me more sensible to recognize more taxa. And if you then come to the conclusion that they shouldn't, that there are more taxa, you can much more easily merge two taxa together than to take an inclusive taxon and try and split it apart. And so it makes more sense to me to err on the side of recognizing more taxa. But I realize that irritates many of my colleagues. But but I think it's it's a way of dealing with the early hominin fossil record, which allows you to change your mind more easily. And so that's, I think that would be in conflict with most of my colleagues.
Thank you. And a similar type question about your own research. So you've played a major role in reshaping hominin taxonomy during your career, including reevaluating the boundaries of our own genus, Homo. So what are the biggest challenging in defining a species in the fossil record, and how confident can we be in the current classifications that we have at the moment?
Well, I think the problem is that the only thing we know about these creatures is evidence from their hard tissues. In other words, we have nothing about their soft tissues. And if you were able to ask a guenon how it recognized another species of guenon, it will probably explain to you that it's mainly based on the color of the fur or the color of the face. Well, none of that fossilizes. And that's one of the reasons I'm inclined to recognize more taxa rather than fewer, because I don't think the hard tissue evidence, I don't think the bones and the teeth are necessarily going to tell you how many taxa there really were in the past. I think that how you crack that, I think, is difficult. I think recognizing what the limits of a hard tissue bound fossil record are, I think, is part of what you have to do. And just because you want to know something, it doesn't mean you can necessarily know it using the evidence that you have available. And the other thing is, I think you have to realize that we have a tendency to try and put together a comprehensive explanation of the fossil record, knowing that we don't have all the evidence. I mean, you could have put together a scenario of human evolution when I did my first course in human evolution in 1966. It looks very different from what you would suggest now, and that's largely because there is a lot more evidence than we had then. And we're going to be no more successful coming up with a comprehensive explanation now than my predecessors were in the 1960s. You just have to say, the current evidence suggests that these taxa were around. The current evidence suggests that these taxa were related in a particular way. And if you think recognizing taxa is a problem, trying to recover the relationships among taxa is an even more difficult problem. And I think we need to realize that we just may not have the sort of evidence that allows us to come up with reliable hypotheses about relationships.
You've also contributed greatly to our understanding of another hominin genus, Paranthropus. So what are some of the key features and likely evolutionary significance of this group?
Well, what interests me about Paranthropus, and I know more about Paranthropus boisei than I do about Paranthropus in Southern Africa, is that less than 1.5 million years ago, there was a hominin that was so weird that, if you want to find a functional model for it, you either have to look at fossil lemurs or living pandas. Paranthropus boisei is remarkable in that it has very large chewing teeth and remarkably small canines and incisors. Your your first molar, your first mandibular molar is about the size of your little fingernail, whereas the first mandibular molar of Paranthropus boisei is about the size of your thumbnail, despite it being smaller than you in overall body mass. So these were strange creatures that were probably eating, consuming material, plant material, or underground storage organs, or something of that sort. Whatever they were eating, the isotope signature is very much in the direction of C4. So they were eating grasses or the equivalent of grasses. In other words, the metabolic equivalent of grasses. Earlier, Homo also develops a high C4 signal, despite it having much smaller teeth. And that's probably because early Homo was consuming animals that ate grass rather than were consuming grass itself. So Paranthropus boisei really interests me because it's clearly not an ancestor of modern humans.
And just a brief follow-up, I wonder if you could talk about the potential common ancestor of Homo and Paranthropus, and these two lineages potentially coexisting for a significant amount of time.
I assume that the ancestor would have been Australopithecus-like. It may well have been Australopithecus afarensis, or it may not have been. But one's assumption is that it was sort of Australopithecus-like, and the hypermegadontia that you see in Paranthropus boisei was something that occurred after it diverged from a common ancestor, probably with Homo. But of course, we don't know that, and there is no certainty of that. The interaction. One of my last PhD students, Alexis Alutku, did some really interesting work, and the hypothesis that she developed and we published recently was a little, sort of controversial in the sense that we think there is evidence that Paranthropus boisei was probably in the Omo-Turkana basin before Homo, and that the presence of Paranthropus, you have to remember that Paranthropus boisei is there in larger numbers in the fossil record, and if that reflects the numbers, the population sizes. So I have this sort of notion that Paranthropus boisei was in the Omo-Turkana basin and was occupying a niche which really forced early Homo to be more inventive than it might have inclined to be. And so early Homo, in a sense, had to develop a way of getting food which was independent of the way that Paranthropus boisei was doing. So I think they may have interacted, and the irony is that probably Paranthropus boisei, even though it was there first, is the one that went extinct, and early Homo is the one that lived on more recently than 1.3 million years or 1.2 million years, which is the last time we see Paranthropus boisei in the fossil record there.
Thank you. And your work has emphasized dental and cranial morphology, and you were among the first people to use rigorous phylogenetic methods in paleoanthropology. So how have methodological advances changed our understanding of the hominin fossil record over your career?
Well, I think we've managed to squeeze more evidence. I mean, obviously, if you want to reduce your ignorance about human evolution, you either have to find more fossil evidence or you have to squeeze more information out of the existing fossil evidence. And to my mind, we've been pretty successful. Not we, me, but the discipline has been pretty successful at squeezing more evidence out of the existing fossil evidence by using imaging and various, the methods for extracting isotopes and things of that sort. My feeling is, and this really irritates my paleoanthropological colleagues, that the major advance in human evolution in the past 3 or 4 decades has got nothing to do with fossils. It is everything to do with the molecular evidence, which makes it highly likely that modern humans are more closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos, and that chimpanzees and bonobos are more closely related to modern humans than they are to gorillas. Now, that would come as a bit of a surprise if chimps and bonobos and gorillas were in the same zoo, and the people that came to the zoo and ate ice cream were more closely related to 2 of the apes in the zoo than the third one. And so I think that has provided a sort of analytical structure and relationships which are independent of hard tissue evidence that helps us work out how we might better understand human evolution. So that, I think in my career, I think that's the major advance. And to be honest, I don't think we're any better at recovering relationships than we were when we started trying to do this a couple of decades ago. I don't think anything really sensational has happened.
So moving slightly further back in time in the fossil record, the Sahelanthropus femur has recently returned to the news. You co-authored a study on this specimen a few years ago. So could you explain its significance, its complex history since discovery, and what this femur might suggest about the evolutionary position of this individual?
How much time do you have? The reason I got involved in this was that it became clear over the years that despite nothing much having been published, or actually having been published about the post-cranial remains of Sahelanthropus chadensis, a young woman who was a master's student in Poitiers, among the bones that she had been given to analyze that were not considered early hominin was a femur. And before she started to work on this and to cut it up and to essentially destroy it, she as a good scientist should do, she went through all the specimens that she was going to process. And she thought the femur was suspiciously like the femur of great apes. And despite her bringing this to the attention of her elders and betters, nothing was really done about this. And I think it's become apparent that there is postcranial evidence of Sahelanthropus chadensis. And although this femur lacks a head and the distal end, the information you can squeeze out of the shaft, and Marine Casenave has done a fantastic job doing this, that information would suggest that if it is a hominin, it's a remarkably ape-like looking hominin in terms of the femur. So what that means for whether Sahelanthropus chadensis is a hominin ancestor or whether it represents a clade that is extinct, because we do make a mistake, I think, if we think that all the fossils that we collect, between 8 million years and and 4 million years, that all those fossils are necessarily ancestral to living taxa. And so it may well be that Sahelanthropus chadensis represents a clade that has no living representative. Now, to my mind, that's actually much more interesting than, discovering what you think might be an ancestor of modern humans. And I think realistically, demonstrating that something is ancestral to something else is really, really difficult. There are lots of, logically, I think it's really, really difficult. And we now understand that homoplasy is probably more common than most people think, and homoplasy is similar morphology that was not inherited from the most recent common ancestor. And so homoplasy sort of tells you whoopsies about relationships. You think that the morphology is telling you that these two taxa are closely related, whereas it's not. And so I think Sahelanthropus is interesting to me because of the lessons it sort of should teach us about how we analyze this material. And I got involved in the paper because I thought this young woman, her perspicacity should be recognized and not ignored.
Thank you. So now there's the quick fire questions. So all these questions are asked to all the guests in a particular area, a particular field. So for this, it's hominins.
Right.
But which two recognizable species in the fossil record do you think Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi are most closely related to?
I think they are weird versions of creatures that were sort of ancestral modern humans. I think Homo floresiensis is an example of a sort of island, the result of isolation, genetic isolation on an island in relation to a sort of Homo taxon that's probably reasonably closely related to modern humans. And I think that the same for Homo naledi. Now, you could say that Southern Africa isn't an island, but it's surrounded on three sides by ocean. And if the habitat that connects it to the rest of Africa is not conducive, is not sort of hominin friendly, then it really functions, as an island in terms of genetic isolation. So I think in both cases, they are weird versions of a form of Homo which is not that different from modern humans.
Thank you. So you see quite a recent split, like a recent common ancestor with humans then, rather than a much deeper past that a lot of people propose.
Yeah, I don't think, I don't think there is any evidence that, that either of them are more than 500,000 years old, and probably not that. And so, so that's one thing. But I think morphologically, I don't see anything that suggests that they are descended from Australopiths as opposed to Homo.
Thank you. And what is the most underappreciated fossil site or particular specimen for understanding hominin evolution?
Well, I think one of the fossil sites that has been underappreciated is Cromdry, but Jose Braga has been working there, and he's been collecting just the most amazing infant fossils and juvenile representatives of Paranthropus robustus and maybe other taxa. So I think that's one site. Yeah, I think that, I think crumb-dry would be my nominee.
Yes. And aside from Charles Dawson, who else do you think may have been complicit in the Piltdown man hoax?
Well, I'm not an expert on this. My money is probably on Teilhard de Chardin. I think he was a mischievous soul. There probably must have been somebody in the British Museum, and but I don't know who that was.
Thank you. And the final question is always something beyond research directly. So access to fossil specimens and digital resources remains a contentious issue in paleoanthropology, especially in fossil hominins. So how has this impacted your own research, and how would you like to see the field evolve in terms of resource sharing and collection accessibility?
Well, it's not really affected my research a great deal. I mean, I remember when I was trying to make sense of the Cubiflora hominins, I went to Indonesia, and Sartono, one of the people working there, was exceedingly generous and gave me access to all the fossils, whereas one of the other people working there would let me have a fossil for half an hour and then would take it away and put it back in the safe. So that's the only time that I've really had any sort of impediment put in my way. My sense is that if you're looking for fossils and you find them, you should really work hard to make the information available to the rest of your colleagues as quickly as you can. Now, it's not easy if the fossil is really fragmented and needs a lot of work, like Ardipithecus ramidus. Whether it needed that long is another matter, but I recognize and respect that took a lot of time and effort. Otherwise, I think, there should be a convention that if you find a fossil, its existence and some relatively simple description of it should be available within 2 or 3 years of its discovery. And then, I think the way to police that will be to say, well, if you're not describing the fossils that you have, then you can't go and look for new ones.
Thank you, Professor Wood, for doing this interview. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for the invitation.